Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod, where we are looking at spies. This is all very not 007. You're all used to the idea that intelligence was key to Wellington's success in the Peninsular War, but have you ever heard of Wellington's spies? No, you haven't, but soon you will have, because Bob Burnham has a new book coming out on precisely that, and he joins me today. Bob, great to see you. How are you doing?
Very good. It's great to be here. So how have you been?
I'm all right. Thank you very much for asking. We've got a lot to get through. Like you've been super prepared and sent me 10 pages of responses, and I'm looking at it thinking, right, we're going to do this in 60 minutes, are we?
I
I'm
will
not
speak
sure.
quickly.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's going to be a neatly tied up 60-minute episode for folks, but it's an interesting episode, so people will bear with us, I'm sure. So we're going to start with the basic one on this one: intelligence gathering during this period. How does it work?
Uh, Before I can answer that question, I need to explain the different types of intelligence because it will affect how it was gathered. The first and most obvious is tactical intelligence. This is information that directly affected a battle and was usually provided by pickets, cavalry screens, the infantry on the ground, etc. Example of this is an enemy of force approaching on a flank. The second type is operational intelligence. This is information that will have impact on the planning and execution of a military campaign. This could be topographical information, such as where can a river be crossed or what roads are like in a certain area. Could also be information on what troops the enemy has, where they are located, how many they are, etc. And of course, data on the enemy commanders. The third kind of intelligence, one we most think about from movies and novels, is strategic intelligence in nature. It is usually of political importance and will have a long-term impact on the outcome of the war, but it was not time sensitive. For example, how were the French treating the Spanish civilians? What form of government had the French set up in the Spanish provinces? What type of directives were they receiving from Napoleon? Things that are interesting and important for Wellington to know long term, but not necessarily going to have a major impact on the next year or so. Although the gathering and use of tactical intelligence is interesting, it was something that was handled through a unit's standing orders and not something I will cover today, though. Instead, I want to talk about the men who were tasked to go out to discover the operational intelligence that Wellington needed to plan his campaign. Unlike modern militaries, the British Army of the Napoleonic Wars had no military intelligence corps. Instead, it relied upon officers drawn from the Quartermaster's General Department and occasionally from the Adjutant General's Department. These officers were often untrained volunteers and junior in rank. However, by the end of the war, they became one of the most enduring myths of the Peninsular War. I am, of course, talking about the exploring officer, who was also referred to as observing or scouting officers. The stories told about these individuals as them employed by Wellington to range deep into French-occupied territory to gather intelligence on the enemy. They were said to be mounted on thoroughbred horses that allowed them to confound French efforts to capture them by outriding their pursuers to make their escape. However, like most legends, there is some truth in them, but like any good war story, their exploits get better with each retelling. As early as the mid-1840s, their adventures were fictionalized by James Grant, who wrote a 3-volume novel called The Romance of War, or The Highlanders in Spain. This book was a great success, and soon it was serialized in Colburn's United Service Magazine and Naval and Military Journal. And the third volume were the adventures of the exploring officer Major Culcohen Grant, I probably mispronounced that, of the 11th Foot, which reads like a James Bond office novel.
So you're telling me that in this episode there are going to be no Aston Martin DB5s, no kind of executions, no thwarting attempts to create like a DNA style weapon that's going to wipe out civilization. None of that's going to happen in the course
No,
of this episode. I am deeply disappointed.
oh, if you're expecting that, you're going to be. However, I do have firsthand accounts of the spies who are out there and how they were. Some were captured, some were eluded captured by the skin of their teeth. Uh, Unfortunately, I don't have any of the dark-haired Spanish beauties who were seducing French officers for their information. Could have happened, but I have no info on it.
See, I was expecting like exploding quills and the whole 9 yards. I am bitterly disappointed. So we shall just make do with historical reality, shall we? Although
I'll try
admittedly,
to.
I wasn't there, so how would I know? Um, so we'll talk about these people as individuals. Tell me about these officers and who they were.
Okay, well, I've been able to identify 16 British officers and a handful of Portuguese and Spanish officers. Some of them may have heard of, such as Lieutenant Colonel John Waters of the First Foot, whose finding of a boat was instrumental in getting the British troops across the Douro River in May 1809 when Wellington surprised the French at Oporto. The other one I mentioned was Major Coquelin Grant of the 11th Foot, assigned to Assistant Quartermaster General. Uh, he actually probably had some of the greatest adventures, even had, as I said, a book written about him, and was captured a couple of times. Some of you may be familiar with the Napier brothers. One of them, Charles Napier, was one of the officers, though after doing it for a month, he gave up and said no more. There was Andrew Leaf Hay, 20th Foot. Uh, he decided he was bored with regimental life and volunteered to be one and went wandering through Spain for about 6 months just to see what he could find and send reports back. And he was captured in the process of doing it. Uh, some may, some of you may be familiar with Charles Cox of the 16th Light Dragoons, who was one of Wellington's favorite officers. There's actually a book written on him, though unfortunately they don't discuss much of his intelligence reports. The last three I mentioned, Napier, Leafay, and Cox, have had their letters and memoirs published. However, two whom you may not have heard of were among the most dedicated and successful. These were Colonel John Grant of the 4th Dragoon Guards, who was seconded to the Portuguese, and Captain Louis Ruman of the 97th Foot, who was a German officer serving in the British Army. I will get into what they did shortly, but they, unlike others who only did it for a month or two, they ended up doing it in the case of Ruman for about 5 years. So,
See, what I'm noticing here is you've got some pretty high ranked officers doing. I mean, it varies obviously. Like the captain's okay, that's one thing, but you've got predominantly majors, colonels, no lieutenants in the list that you've mentioned. Is this something that's reserved for people of a particular rank, or is it just that these are the ones that people might have heard of?
these were the ones that might have heard of. There were a handful of lieutenants. The main reason you don't hear many lieutenants is the fact that most of them were drawn from the Quartermaster General's department, and there's not too many lieutenants in the Quartermaster General. I will discuss one later on, Lieutenant William Light, who actually left a very detailed diary with all his information he found in northern Spain in 1813. Uh, uh, John Grant, who is one of the major people I'm going to talk about today, I mentioned him as a colonel. He was a colonel in the Portuguese army, but he was only an ensign in the Dragoon Guards when he was became uh, one of these spymasters, as I call them. And again, it was one of these cases he wasn't getting promoted. Matter of fact, he was on half pay when he volunteered to do it, and ended up leaving the Portuguese army in 1814 as a full colonel, which is going from an ensign to a full colonel in about 5 years is quite an accomplishment.
That is not bad at all, is it? Okay, let's talk about what these guys do. What are their missions day to day? You know, I'm guessing that they get like a Mission Impossible style gramophone and LP dispatched to them because, of course, they were period correct. And then like the message goes up in flames, or does it like self-destruct? Obviously, I'm being facetious. So talk me through the reality of like these guys, how they get their missions, what they're told to do. Do they have this whole your mission if you choose to accept it thing going on?
Nothing that exotic. And based on my experience as a former military intelligence officer, I'm amazed at how nonchalant everything was. They would basically be sent out there and say, go out and collect information. And initially, they weren't even told what to look for. Uh, and they were often sent on a variety of missions, and they varied in length. The first kind was to collect a specific sort of information, obviously, and the individual rarely went more than once. As I mentioned, one of them was Major Charles Napier of the 50th Foot. The second kind of mission was very vague in its concept, and I refer to it as the wandering tourist. Generally, the officer went out, usually on his own, to see what he can find and report back. The headquarters didn't give him much guidance. Uh, I mentioned Andrew Leaf Hay. He did leave a detailed account of his wandering, but did not appear to have accomplished anything beyond getting himself captured after about 3 months. The third were the officers sent out to find information on roads, bridges, fords, etc., or topographical information. We often read accounts where Wellington, or in the early days of the war, they would go out, the army would start marching down the road and realize that they can't get over the road with the artillery, or the cavalry can't survive in the harsh conditions, etc. So for Wellington, he needed to find out if he was going to go into the area, he needed to know what was there. This was the most common mission, surprisingly, and the officer could be sent out for months at a time. I mentioned William Light of the 4th Dragoons. He was an anomaly because he was a lieutenant assigned to the Quartermaster's General's Department. In January 1813, he was sent into the mountains in northern Portugal and Spain to map out the routes for the movement of the cavalry and artillery during the upcoming campaign. And his diary is basically a travel log. It says, okay, I went from village A to village B. I had to cross this river. The ford there's no bridge there, would be impassable for artillery. You get to the village, there's enough fodder there at this point that might support a regiment of cavalry, no more than 2 at the most, and very boring information, but vital for planning future campaigns. And he did this for all of 1813. He was in northern Spain, up in Galicia, northern Portugal. Then after Victoria, they sent him up into the mountains of the Pyrenees, and he did that for many, many months. The final mission was what I refer to as a spy master. Again, they were members of the Quartermaster General's Department, tasked to set up networks of spies and informants, the James Bonds of the time. As mentioned previously, they included Corcoran Grant, John Grant, and Louis Ruman. Their webs of spies and informants crisscrossed western and central Spain. Their original mission, like Lieutenant Light's, was to provide topographical information, but soon they were tasked to collect military and political information. Their networks kept watch on both the French and Spanish military activity that threatened Portugal. Notice they said Spanish, too, not just the French. And as in case of the Spanish, activities that they were doing that would impact the defense in Portugal. By late 1812, the Spymasters' reach was deep into French-occupied Spain. Captain Ruman gathered reports near the Pyrenees in October of 1812. 6 months later, in the winter of 1813, he was located within 50 kilometers of the French border around San Sebastian. Wellington considered the report so important, he gave priority to funding their operations. And the time, basically in 1810 and 1811, when money was in very short supply, the fact that they were getting the equivalent of a year's pay to go out and pay their own informants and spies is a good indication that how important Wellington considered them. John Grant, the ensign who was serving in the Portuguese army, served 30 months in French-occupied Portugal and Spain. while Louis Ruman served for 48 months. Like all good intelligence officers, unfortunately, Grant and Ruman worked in the dark, and little is known about their personal lives, nor any portraits of them known to exist. So,
So basically, they've set a precedent there in making sure that they can't be identified in the street. Like, oh, it's all very cloak and dagger, and I'm going to make it Assassin's Creed if I want to. Um, but I this is impressive. But when you think about it, there's a certain logic to Wellington prioritizing this, isn't there? Because this is one of the things he's particularly focused on here is fundamentally logistics. Like, how do I feed my army when it moves into a region? Can I cross this river? Can I get supplies there? Can I deploy artillery in this direction? All things that fundamentally scuppered more in 1808. So you can see the logic behind what he's doing, but it's a very Wellingtonian approach to intelligence, if you see what I mean.
oh, definitely, and it paid off when he used it. For example, it was the routes that he used for planning the 1813 campaign that basically ended up evicting the French out of Spain was based on the information that Lieutenant Light brought back on where he could move his artillery, where he could use his cavalry. It's where they didn't pay attention, they started having problems. And I'll give an example is during the retreat back to the Portuguese border in 1812, they had the routes, the way to go. Unfortunately, the Commissary General Department in 1812 chose to ignore it and set up all the supplies on one road network while the Army marched on another one. And basically, typical of the British Army at the time, and when they're very good in offense during the retreat, when things start going bad, like troops aren't being fed, things fall apart quickly. And in the case of 1812, it was because they chose to ignore the intelligence on the road they already had.
That's so interesting. I didn't realize that. Well, in some respects, I suppose it is blind incompetence, but I always never quite got why. I certainly never got the intelligence kind of failure thing. You know, they had the intel and they didn't act on it. That is really
Well, the
interesting.
collecting is very important, but disseminating the intelligence is also important. In this case, it was definitely a failure to disseminate it to the people who needed it,
Yeah, it's
and
all
or
very
the
well
people who
having the intel, you know, X is going to happen or you need to be at Y. But if that doesn't reach the right people, it's not much use, is it?
no,
Um,
it isn't. So in modern organizations, there's you have the collectors, you have the analysts, and then you have the disseminators, and all three of them are equally important. Uh, and the dissemination I'll mention later on, but in the case of 1812, the retreat, it definitely failed. Uh,
so the networks these guys are setting up as they go, how big are they? Because I can't imagine it's solely a case of sort of you ride all the way to the Pyrenees and then write a letter, you know, dear Wellington, bring one regiment of cavalry to this village, they'll be fine. Lots of love, you know, Lieutenant X, because we're going to be clandestine about it, or Captain Y. Um, and then you sort of take that letter and pop it in the mail. That's really not how this system works. So, in terms of these networks, how do they operate? Who do they involve? How do they facilitate that communication?
okay, well, first thing is you mentioned topographical information. That's totally different than what well, it's extremely important as we've discussed already, but the spy masters originally went out to collect that, but then they switched over to start collecting more information. What was the enemy doing? What are the capabilities? What are our allies supposedly doing? What are their capabilities, etc. From so they went out and initially started collecting information themselves, but if you read their initial reports, they often read like a travelogue. They provided information on train as well as the enemy and Spanish troops. However, by only reporting on what they personally saw, they severely limited the amount of information they could send back. By the beginning of 1810, both Grant and Ruman changed their methods. Although they continue to report what they witnessed, more often the reports are the results of the networks of spies that they have set up. Their informants included travelers, tavern owners, merchants, landowners, probably a sexy bartender in there someplace, a local government official, farmers, clergy, guerrillas, even peasants. And they were spread throughout western, central, and southern Spain in 1810. And I cannot overemphasize about the only place they really didn't have the network set up was in northern Spain. They were down deep in southern Spain also. By 1811, Grant and Ruman had established networks that were covered a large part of Spain. Captain Ruman was responsible for the area centered on Salamanca that extended north of Valladolid and east towards Madrid. Grant's network focused on the southern approaches to Portugal, and many of his reports were about French activity near Plasencia, Caceres in the south, and Talavera to the east. The pontoon bridge, which crossed the Tagus River at Almarez, which all French troops heading south in the central of Spain use, is often mentioned by him. He also extensively reported on the French invasion of southern Spain in the winter of 1810. Everyone, well, let me rephrase that. People may not be aware of, but by the end of 1809, the French had basically conquered only about half of Spain. It wasn't until 1810 that they moved into the southern half. By 1811, the two spies had established networks that covered most of Spain. By the autumn of 1812, Colonel Grant was out of the spy business, and Captain Ruman had moved deep into French-occupied Spain near Pamplona. And that sounds okay. That's not too difficult. However, he was 500 kilometers from the nearest British troops at the time. There he worked close with Spanish guerrilla leader Francisco Mina. He gathered copies of French dispatches, newspapers, personal correspondence, and official bulletins the guerrillas had taken, as well as rumors reported by the variety of sources in the French garrison towns. In the winter of 1813, Ruman moved his base of operations, as I said, near San Sebastian. He was in contact with the local guerrillas there, but since he had never worked in the area, he had to establish relations with them, as well as setting up a new network of informants. At this point, the type of information he collected changed. For the first time, most of it was at the strategic level, and not just about the military. His reports still focused on the French army, but much of it was on the units being withdrawn to France that could be used by Napoleon to rebuild his army that was destroyed in 1812 during the Russia campaign. Ruman also reported quite often on the political news from France and Central Europe.
See, that's interesting because I suppose what he's doing is feeding Wellington information when it comes to, the political news that might actually have to go ordinarily from Central Europe to London, to Lisbon, to the front line. So he's basically kind of cutting off two sides of the square there. I hadn't kind of considered that would be useful. How do these guys operate?
Well, another good question. As I said, they were assigned an area to operate out of. John Grant was responsible for covering French activity that threatened Portugal from the southern route, i.e., through Badajoz and Elvas, including Alcantara. Ruman had the northern approaches that ran from Salamanca to Ciudad Rodrigo to Alameda. Of course, why at this point was important? Because the primary focus of Wellington was the defense of Portugal. He was not thinking about going on the offense. Their areas overlap, but generally the reports do not duplicate each other. Their base of operations was always in a small village near a major road, which made it easier to receive and send reports. They would stay in the village for several weeks and then move to another location in the area. The villagers were friendly and they usually lived with a family, but they had to ensure that they did not overstay their welcome. The presence was a burden on their hosts if they could not pay for their food and lodging as well as the upkeep of their horses. Even if they had the money, many of the villagers were poor before the war, and under French occupation, food and forage became harder to get. The spymaster might be able to pay for it, but then the hosts would have to go without. So they had a choice: do I feed my children, or do I feed this foreigner? To ease the burden, Grant and Ruman would move on after a few weeks, but this had to be balanced with their operational requirements also. Once they set up the network, their spies and headquarters had to know where to find them. So when they moved to a new location, it was usually within a day's travel, so that when a message arrived in an old location, their previous host would know where to forward it to. In 1809, Grant and Ruman started out with each a servant and a sergeant to act as a courier back to their headquarters. The party also includes several horses to ride and carry their baggage. And you can see that suddenly three strangers show up, and the impact that would have on the village. By 1810, however, neither had a military courier attached to them, though both had a servant, while Grant was also accompanied by a 14-year-old Irish boy. In the latter years, Ruman would travel alone and likely hired a servant and a groom at his base of operations.
I'm sorry, I can't let you just dangle that little thread there of a 14-year-old Irish lad and not pull on it. I am a fish. I have been hooked. Um, Tell me why? Why a 14-year-old? Why particularly an Irish boy? I'm guessing it's not his son. What the hell is going on there? What is he thinking?
Well, I don't know for sure. Some reports say he was part of the Loyal Lusitanian Legion back in 1809. Others said that he was commissioned as a British officer. He was not a British officer, but he was commissioned as one of the British in the Portuguese army. To make it what a 14-year-old could add to the quality of the Portuguese army is beyond me. Makes it more interesting. Um, this individual was wounded, captured, and spent the rest of the war. And this is in 1810 when he was wounded and captured, and ended up as a prisoner of war until 1814. Because he was in uniform, he wasn't shot out of hand. So why Grant chose to bring this 14-year-old boy with him is beyond me. It's
I think it's probably beyond all of us, apart from maybe Grant himself. You've talked about it, or at least alluded to it already there. The penalties if you get caught. I figured that wearing a uniform was going to be key to this because if you're in uniform, you you might be a spy, but you kind of can't be treated entirely as a spy. Do you know what I mean? So talk me through what people can and can't do, or perhaps there's a difference between what people can and can't do and what they actually do to these guys if they get caught.
well, surprisingly, um, I know of 4 or 5 interest cases where they were caught or very close to being caught. Uh, they they did take steps to in case that happened, and the most obvious was they always wore their uniform, and when they were out and about. But if they were caught in a village and they weren't in uniform, but say they're in their house and they were caught out of uniform, technically they could be treated as a spy. And if that happened, by the rules of the war at the time, they could be executed on the spot. However, that I did not find a case of where that happened. Uh, this They practice some form of what I would call operational security, or what's known today as OPSEC. So the first thing they did, obviously, to prevent being captured and have to face the fact that they may be shot for if they weren't in uniform, was they wore the uniform. Second step they took to prevent the French from knowing where they were, they rarely stayed in the same location longer than a few weeks. They constantly moved. However, by modern standard, their OPSEC was weak. How Part of the problem is that their spies had to know where to send their information. So that their network of informants always knew at least the general area where they were staying at. Should one of their spies be captured, there was a chance that he would divulge their location. And the more who knew where to find them, the greater the danger was. So they had a balance. Okay, if I don't tell the spy where to send the information, then how am I going to collect it? But if I tell them where I'm located and they reveal it to someone else or a double agent, then I'm risking myself and my whole operation. This danger was quite real. However, there's no evidence in the letters that either Grant or Roman used dead drops or a cutout who would collect information from a variety of sources and then funnel the results to them. The letters came to them and wherever they were located at. And as bad as this security breach was, they both endangered themselves in the reports to headquarters. At the beginning of each report that they sent back, they always wrote where they were writing from. Should their courier that they sent back be captured and the letter found, their whole letter would be, or whole operation would be exposed. The problem was just not in the transmittal of the report. We have found no evidence on how the reports were handled as they passed up through the chain of command at the Army headquarters. The more people who read them, the greater the chance the information in the report would be talked about in passing, and critical information might be accidentally revealed. The protection of information that in modern times would be highly classified with limited distribution was rarely practiced, from what I could tell. Some of our listeners may be aware of Wellington's codebreaker, George Scoville. Scoville was a genius when it came to deciphering French messages that were written in imperial code, but his OPSEC was sorely lacking. During the Battle of Salamanca in 1812, he wandered about the front lines with the key to the French cipher in his pocket, as well as the following year when he was with the Light Division in the vanguard of the whole army. If he had been captured, the French would have changed their cipher and Wellington would have no longer been able to read Napoleon's mail. So, I mean, this is fundamental operational security that was not practiced. Unfortunately, how Grant and Ruhlman secured the list of sources in their reports they received from their spies is unknown. I couldn't find no evidence of how they did it. Both narrowly avoided capture in 1810, and in their letters discussing their escape, they allude to losing their baggage. Did this loss include the names of their spies or their reports? If they had lost them, their whole network could have been rolled up and their spies captured and executed.
Wow, that's lax. I am loving the idea of Scoville just casually wandering around the front line during Salamanca, as you do. Um, no regard for like the fact that he's got the equivalent of the breaking of Enigma literally sitting in his pocket. That's appalling, quite frankly, and hilarious in equal measure. Um,
It's mind-boggling. It's
it is.
from today's perspective.
Yeah, I suppose that's the point, right? That today we have a much more well-established um, system of operational security, and because we're used to sort of the Hollywoodization of um, the role of spies, some of these things seem really obvious to us, but at the time, perhaps less so.
Yeah, it's to me, as I said, it's mind-boggling that some of the things that happen. But part of it may be the fact that we things aren't as time sensitive then as they are now. If, let's say, Scoville was captured and someone found the cipher and looked at it, would he know what it was? And if he passed it up to through the chain of command, how long would it take? Figure a horse could maybe ride 30, 40 kilometers a day. It may take 2 months to reach Paris. Uh, so, yeah, it's just unbelievable some of the things that happened.
So this job, how dangerous is it? Granted, dumb question there, but like lay it on the line for us. How much of a risk are these guys taking?
In short, very dangerous. As I said, to lessen the danger, they always rode in uniform. However, there was an ever-present chance that the officer would have bad luck and be captured by a French patrol, or they might be betrayed by a local villager. Everyone thinks that Spain was, up in arms against the French as soon as they invaded. However, 1809, 1810, or 1810, the attitude towards the French occupation was different than from the latter years. So I've read cases where French couriers would travel by themselves in the early days and survive, obviously, to write their account. While in the latter years, it would be a whole regiment of cavalry that would go with them, make sure they made it through. Or it might even be something as simple as a local villager gossiping at the wrong time about a British officer in the area, in the tavern saying, hey, they got this foreigner here, he's been living in my village for a couple of months now. I mean, it happened. People talk. We know at least four of the exploring officers either being captured or in danger of being captured. Both Grant and Ruman narrowly avoided captured in 1810 when the French learned of their presence. Grant wrote in one letter that I take the liberty of mentioning to your excellency, who was Beresford, as an instance of the vigilance and confidence that is to be placed in the Spanish cavalry, which had very nearly cost me my liberty. This detachment had established 2 cavalry outposts with videts on the place where I was staying. Notwithstanding all these precautions, 80 of the enemy's cavalry from Caceres cut them off, and by 6 o'clock this morning, they completely surrounded the village and at the same time entered the place. They put to death all the military that had fled and made prisoners of all the rest, excepting a few who assumed the clothing of peasants. On those entering the street, I was quartered in, and observing them from the front gate, I shut it, mounted my horse, and accompanied by a Portuguese servant, attempted to escape their notice. On getting out of the village, I found parties in threes and fours in every possible direction. I assumed as much as possible their careless manner and appearance and walked my horse until I got near the weakest part of their circle. I had then no other resource than to try the fleetness of my horse and force my way through, which I effected, pursued by several for a quarter of a league. On finding that they could not overtake me, they desisted from the pursuit. My servant was not so fortunate. Him they shot. I've lost my little baggage and 3 Portuguese horses. Okay, what he doesn't mention, he lost his 14-year-old companion, too, who was shot in the knee, became a prisoner. And in his baggage, all his papers, all his reports, anything he's been writing before, he basically escaped by the skin of his teeth. I mentioned Lieutenant Leif Hay, one of the officers who volunteered to ride into French-occupied territory, find information. He was captured in 1813 and was not exchanged for several months. The most famous spy master, who I've mentioned several times, Colquhoun Grant, was captured in 1813, sent to Paris, where he finally made his escape after posing as a good American. What is not well known is that it was the second time he had been captured. The first was in the autumn of 1811 near Talavera, but he was able to escape with the assistance of Spanish guerrillas. Ruman moved his base of operations near San Sebastian in the winter of 1813, and interesting, the local French commander soon heard that there was a British officer in the area. Instead of expending scarce resources trying to capture him, the commander restricted the movements of the local people. Okay, that helped protect Ruman, but it had an impact. It reduced his ability to gather intelligence because he didn't have his informants. They weren't able to get in. Ruman and Grant were always conscious they could be captured at any time and did take practical measures. Ruman moved his base of operations 28 times in 7 months. That's basically every week. That was in 1810. As for the actual civilian spies, as I said before, if they'd been caught, they would have been executed.
Yeah, the same courtesy not extended. But then you could always make the case, well, they're in mufti. And also, there's also this argument, isn't there, that well, they're traitors because there's a new regime in Madrid, even if it is a Bonapartist regime that's been installed from the top. But that's a whole debate for another day. Um, I'm very curious about the way in which these guys are selected and how prepared they are or aren't. So, with that in mind, two kind of questions spring to mind. One is there any kind of prior experience that these guys have in this sort of thing? And the second is, do they get any training? Is there any kind of selection process? You've mentioned that a number of these guys are from the Quartermaster General's Department. Is there any attempt to kind of go, look, here is your crash course on how to evade capture from, the whilst you're out in fundamentally enemy territory?
Initially, I would say no. Uh, I think rumors spread about these guys who are out there doing it, and they. One of the things we think about the Peninsular War, where they're always fighting, they're always on a kind of campaign and doing things that might be a little exciting. In reality, it was the exact opposite. Most of the time, they were in some type of billet or cantonment uh, away from the French, and you're sitting around doing nothing, and you get bored. And so, my gut feeling is that most of them volunteered because they were bored with regimental life. And hey, here's my chance to actually do something. Uh, so most of those, other than the ones I keep on mentioning, Grant and Ruman, most of them went out for only a few months and returned to the unit with no consequences. Charles Napier lasted about a month before it decided it was not for him. Yeah, boredom be damned, but man, this is not what I signed up for. In June 1811, he was ordered to ride to Medellin, which was deep in French occupied territory and about 100 kilometers away from the nearest friendly force. He was not happy with the orders. In a letter to his mother, he said, "If you don't hear from me, be not uneasy, for taking no baggage, means of riding may not be found. This mission displeases me. My duty will be to get information of the enemy, but I will not go near him to risk being taken." So this was one of those reluctant volunteers. Now, what type of training did they receive before they went out? There's no indication that they received any before going out. In the early days, they reported on, as I said, what they personally saw, but this was limited on what they could collect. You may have heard of Colonel Benjamin Durbin, who was a graduate of the British Staff College, and he was also the Portuguese Quartermaster General. Well, he was the one who handled the reports initially from Grant and Ruman. He formalized the tasking of what he wanted them to look at. This is what today is what we would call it a collection plan. And the British Staff College taught their officers how to make one. And we know they used it in the peninsula. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to find it. It may not exist any longer. However, they also used one in the Walcheren expedition of 1809, and Captain Frederick Trench of the 1st Foot Guards, who was a deputy assistant quartermaster general, kept a record of it in his journal. And he went out as, back then, basically an exploring officer, and to see what he could find in the area of the lowlands they were. And a lot of it would be germane to what they wanted to know in the peninsula. For example, these are exact quotes from his collection plan. What troops are in the country and of what description? That's pretty basic. Where are they stationed? Is the country much intersected with ditches? If so, how are they to be passed? If by bridges, which are the principal ones? Are the bridges of stone or wood? Where are the principal garrisons? How are they protected? Are they in forts, earthworks, stone? Of what form? Revetted or not? Ditches? How wide? Are there any bomb proofs with them? What are the farms? What type of crops do they grow? What mills are there? You know, grown food's fine, but if you can't, or crops, but if you can't mill it into flour, it's not going to do you any good. And where's the water? Okay, and it goes on and on. There was like 2 pages of them. And this is pretty basic stuff, but if you can see from it, this is the same information that Wellington needed. So this was a type of collection plan. And although they seemed very mundane, in many ways, the British Army was operating blind when it came to knowledge about the conditions of the roads and bridges in the countryside. So, and as I mentioned before, in 1813, even after being in country for 4 years, they still had no idea what northern Spain looked like. And that's why prior to the Victoria campaign, Wellington did send out the spies or the collection officers. And this was just for topographical information. Unfortunately, I have no data except one, and which about what the headquarters was looking for in the way of troops or commanders. And I'll discuss that a little further on.
So we've alluded to this already. Collecting a report is one thing, getting it back to base is another. Can we just talk a bit more about that transmission of reports and the way that it
That's a good point.
works?
And as I said, collecting it is one thing. Getting it back to the headquarters is totally different. The question is, if I'm 100 or 200 kilometers behind the enemy lines, how do I get it back? If I take it back, then what happened to all my reports? So the reports, let's talk first about how they got it from their own informants. From the letters, the spymasters wrote, it appears that the message was carried to them by travelers who regularly came through the area. They didn't have a set of couriers who would go from, okay, this is Monday, I'm hitting Salamanca, I'm going to stop and talk to all the spies, get their letters, and then move on to the next village. Instead, it was kind of happen chance, where the messages would be passed by someone going through the area. It could be just a traveler, it could be a merchant, it could be a muleteer, and they even, from what I could tell, used the post office, the postal service, to get the messages sent. Once the information reached the spymaster, he would evaluate it and then send it back to his headquarters. Originally, they had mounted soldiers, as I said, from the loyal Lusitanian Legion to carry the reports back to their boss, but this arrangement stopped by 1810. The same methods that spy used to get the information to them was likely used to pass it up to the headquarters. The couriers were probably paid to carry it because the closer they got to the area where Wellington's army was, the more heavily patrolled it was by the French, and therefore the danger increased. The courier might be stopped and arrested should one of the reports found. Neither Grant nor Ruman numbered their messages, which would have allowed headquarters to determine if a previous letter had not been delivered. Occasionally, they would mention a letter that was sent on a certain date, but a copy of it does not exist in the archives. I have no way of knowing whether the recipient had received it or not, or if he received it, not bothered to save it at the headquarters. Sometimes the spymaster had to get creative on how to get the information back to his headquarters. In June 1811, Ruman had interviewed 2 gentlemen who had valuable information, lots of it. Rather than transmitting a lengthy report they had given him, Ruman sent them to the headquarters to be interviewed by General Durbin. The spymasters always had the option of carrying the reports themselves, and they might have done this, especially when they needed more money. However, there's nothing in their letters that indicated that they did it. As problematic as sending the reports was, how did the spymasters receive the messages from their own headquarters? You had to have this two-way flow of information, especially if the headquarters wanted to change their tasking. They said, we need to find out about X now instead of Y. In several letters, both Grant and Ruman asked for news from home, for information on what's going on regarding promotions, monies, etc. They were isolated from their friends and comrades in the army, and the longer they stayed incommunicado, the more they felt it. By the autumn of 1812, Ruman was over 500 kilometers from Wellington, and getting any word from the rear was extremely difficult. The problem for the headquarters was that they only knew the general location of where the spymaster was. Although they would begin their letters with the location, by the time the letter reached headquarters, they would have moved on. Due to security reasons, as I said, Roman changes location frequently. So I talk about this in the book. Durbin needed to get information to Grant. And the border between Spain and Portugal, especially up in the central region, is high mountains, some of the highest mountains in Portugal and in Spain. And there was a letter by one of the couriers who was a British officer who was tasked to carry not only a letter, but a couple £100 of British pounds to fund the operation. He was only 50 kilometers away. And it took him almost 2 days to go through the mountains to get to the spy and track him down. And of course, the spy was very happy to finally get news from home, meet a friendly face, and wanted him to go out in operations with him. But the gentleman said, no, he had to get back. And it took him another 2 days of riding a horse to get back to the headquarters. And that was only 50 kilometers because the terrain was very rugged. So it's communication was probably key for them, because they had to, if it was timely information, in most cases it wasn't, but it was something Wellington needed to know, there wasn't a fast way to get it back and a way of even ensuring that it made it back.
Okay, so you've talked us through the the agents, if you will, the 007s, the people in the field. But of course, there's also a network behind them, just as there is a network that feeds them. Scoville, an obvious example that we've talked about already. And I'm sure there are others. So just give us a sense of the other key figures who were involved in this and what their role within this system was day to day.
Well, surprising, the two cases we know of, the two spymasters we know of that left detailed reports, reported up to the Portuguese Army Quartermaster General. And that was Benjamin Durbin, a British officer, who was, as I mentioned earlier, trained at the Staff College. And their letters, 90% of them were directed straight to him. In one case, Wellington got involved and said, there's too many people, it's going through too many hands. We want you to only send your letters. At the time, it was William Cox, who was the commandant of the fortress of Alameda. Well, that was fine for up until early 1810, when in July of 1810, Alameda suddenly became surrounded by the French army and eventually fell. So they had to set up another system. But basically, it went straight back to Durbin, and he was responsible for disseminating it up. We know that Wellington did receive some of the reports. How many did actually made it up to his headquarters, or whether they were filtered out by Durbin before he sent them back, we don't know. But I think the vast majority were probably copied and sent back to Wellington. I did not mention is the fact that all the reports that I use in the book and that I basis of this talk, I found in the Portuguese archives. I have not been able to find any reports in the British archives. They may be out there, but I don't know where. So unfortunately, we don't have a good idea of what happened to the information once it reached the headquarters. Now, in the case of Light, the lieutenant who wandering in northern Spain, we know his went back directly to Wellington's quartermaster general, and they had several officers there analyzing the information to do their planning. But this again is the topographical information. Maybe it's the basis for a new book if I can find information on it, but I'm not holding my breath on it being readily available either. So,
Okay, so talk us through big discoveries then, their big discoveries. What are sort of the big wins that these guys are responsible for? And equally, I guess, are there any sort of howlers besides what we've already talked about with 1812? Are there any moments where you kind of go, but how did they miss that? That doesn't make any sense.
uh, let's talk about the big discoveries first. Grant and Ruman were superb in providing information on the enemy order of battle, troop strength, health of troops, and on enemy commanders. And I mentioned that before, but this last bit of information was very important, especially in 1810. It is rare that we have anything from the top down that survived, where they were tasked to provide specific information. As I said, the collection plans, we couldn't find it. However, we know Wellington was very interested in the gritty information about the French troops, but he also needed to know about information on the enemy commanders, especially in 1810. It was fairly common knowledge that the French were going to invade Portugal in 1810, and Wellington was making plans for that. Obviously, the lines that towards Vedras, but he also knew that Napoleon had not appointed a commander of the army that was going to invade Portugal. And so he knew that until the army commander was arrived, the invasion wasn't going to happen. And Grant and Ruman were specifically tasked by him to find out who the commander was, when he arrived, and when he would join the army near Ciudad Rodrigo. Interesting, they both reported on the arrival of Marshal Messina, who was the commander, and he was appointed, I think, in late April 1810, and he arrived in Salamanca in mid-May. And they also report on his subsequent movements. So here's the case. Wellington needed to know who the commander was because that was going to affect all his planning. And he went out and said, find out who it's going to be and when he arrives. And they both did. It's the one case where I can definitely show that the information they were providing was critical to the operations for Wellington. And interesting, during that time, the sheer volume of reports that Grant and Ruman provided was staggering. Between them, they wrote 60 reports in 6 months. This works out being an average of 10 reports per month or one every 3 days, or it's worked its way back to the headquarters. The ones that survived. There were probably others that did not make it back or were never saved. So they were collecting that information and sending it back very quickly. And I'll give an example of the type of information that they sent back. This is going to be a report from John Grant. It was written on 15 June 1810, and it was to Marshal Beresford. The report was about 750 words long and written on 2 sheets of paper. The French at this time were preparing for the invasion of Portugal, but first Ciudad Rodrigo had to be captured. So all the information basically that I'm going to talk about right from this report were relevant to the invasion of Portugal, which is about 45% of the report. The rest were covered military activity in the rest of Spain, as well as political activities of the French installed by King Joseph. Grandson provided information on the strength of the army, the number of sick, its morale, the movement of its commander, Messina, the problems he was having with subordinate commanders, and the movement of its siege artillery, which was still a long ways from Ciudad Rodrigo. So he starts off with his location, Cerradilla, which is south of in the mountains around a place called Coria, 15 June 1810. Sir, the enemy's effective army in Old Castile consists of 3 corps of about 10,000 men each. The total of their strength, including all the provinces, may be near 40,000 men. In Salamanca and Valladolid, there were 5,000 men in the hospital, nearly an equal number in garrison, and various other detachments. These, side note, these detachments were guarding the lines of communication. So they have 30,000 men, but they may have 500 here in this village protecting the supply trains coming in. Okay, in the former city of Salamanca, there's a very considerable mortality, and the effective army are much disaffected, most unwilling to commit themselves against the British army. So here's basically saying they're sick, the men are dying from disease, and the morale is shot to hell. They don't want to fight. They don't want to be there. Messina has been down to Ney's headquarters at Esprit, from whence he returned to Salamanca on the 11th, much displeased with Ney's army. Esprit was Sancta Spiritus, a village about 20 kilometers from Ciudad Rodrigo. He then moves on to say the enemy's heavy artillery from Salamanca and Astorga has not yet reached its destination, owing to the bad state of the roads. Why is this important? Before Messina could move into Portugal, he had to take the forts of Ciudad Rodrigo and Almeida. If you don't have the heavy artillery there, it's not going to happen. Heavy artillery moved about 10 kilometers a day. So Wellington would be able to figure out that, okay, if they're 150 kilometers away from the fort, they're not going to be there at least for another 2 weeks at the very earliest with the heavy artillery. Junot and Messina were both in Salamanca on the 12th, into which place was brought a general who had been wounded and many cars of soldiers in similar situation. Okay, here he drops a subordinate commander's name. He's already mentioned Ney as one of the corps commanders. Now he brings up Junior, who was senior enough, how to be a corps commander. It continues still to be reported that Messina's intention is to attempt Portugal if much difficulty is experienced against Ciudad Rodrigo. And the report gains credit from information I have secured from several reports that Rainier's corps is to join Messina's army by the way of Placentia. So now he's got identified the 3rd Corps on its way moving into the area. It's certain the total number of reinforcements that actually enter Spain this winter, including Junot's corps, up to the 20th of May, does not exceed 40,000 men, a great proportion of which are young conscripts. Grant then closes the evaluation of the quality of the information provided by some of his sources. Quote, I hear nothing certain as yet expected considerable reinforcements. Their constant marching and counter-marching mask their real numbers and often induce the peasantry to exaggerate their numbers. So he said, okay, yeah, this is information we have. I think it's good. However, it's not as detailed as you may hope I could get it. So in here, you have numbers of troops, how good a health, they have major health problems. They have command issues between Ney and Messina, but the fact that 2 more senior commanders have joined them. So this is in May, so you can see that the buildup is happening, and it's going to come soon. And it did. It ended up by June. They were the siege of Ciudad Rodrigo had begun.
Okay, so those are sort of key moments and successes, and they are not insignificant ones. I'm also not surprised by the kind of healthy skepticism. We have this information, but actually, can we trust it? But let's talk about the people who we always describe as not having a decent intelligence network, which may actually be incorrect. And that's the French. From their perspective, you can imagine that it's not for lack of trying, but in a deeply hostile country, it's fine when you've got a Francesados that you can draw upon for local information. But if you just send off lone officers into the Spanish heartland, if you're French, there's a very good chance that those individuals aren't going to come back because they're going to be very dead, courtesy of Spanish guerrillas. So, what are the French doing and how do they try and solve that problem?
Very good question, and not something we know a whole lot about. Uh, but I think we do have or there is a misperception of what was going on in the peninsula at the time. We think of, as I said earlier, that this mass uprising by the Spanish against the French. Uh, and it did happen in the end. However, in the first couple of years, it was a civil war. The French moved in, they installed basically a puppet government, and that survived for another 4 or 5 years. Uh, and they had their sources. They did go out, they talked to people. If you look at their campaigns, yeah, some they were operating in the blind, but they pretty much conquered all of Spain within a year and a half. By March of maybe it was April of 1810, they were down at besieging Cadiz. They have conquered every major city in Spain other than Cadiz, and they had set up governments in there. So they were getting information. The quality of the information and the amount, I don't have any idea. But they had to have some sources.
So, it's been an incredible kind of run through of these things, and we'll talk about where folks can go and read more about this in just a second. But the just to kind of wrap this up for us and give us a sense of impact, how big a deal would you say these spy networks are for the Peninsular War? And perhaps give us an indication of what does the Peninsular War look like for Wellington if he doesn't have them? And I am inclined to be facetious and ask, is it basically like trying to fight with a paper bag over your head if you're Wellington and you don't have this spy network? Do you end up basically doing a John Moore and completely screwing up your advance into Spain?
You're absolutely correct. And I think Wellington realized that. And you mentioned John Moore and his advance into Spain. 1809 campaign into Talavera for the British was not much better. And a lot of it was due basically the lack of intelligence. And if you look at the intelligence they had, even up to 1810, it wasn't much. But the area around Salamanca between 1810 and 1811 was well covered by then. And mostly due to the efforts of Ruman and Grant. They were sending, as I mentioned, many, many reports back on what was going on. And, the one report I gave you was just on the military side of it, but there was also reports on the impacts of the French foraging parties going into villages and collecting food and stuff. And while it may not sound all that important, however, it did give Wellington a picture of what it was like in the countryside. Well, from two perspectives. One, if he moves in there, all the fodder and grain is gone. So he cannot depend on that to support him. The second thing is, I think at the very best, the Spanish peasants and locals were neutral at the very beginning of the war. They didn't want to be bothered, but the way the French operated in Spain, they had to feed themselves, and they didn't pay for it in most cases. And this alienated the population. By 1812, 1813, they turned against the French. And Wellington used this. He knew it, and if you compare his early campaigns to the later campaigns, the difference between night and day. Just he knew what to expect when he was going in there. He knew what the French were doing, where they were, and what the roads were capable. And I would say he was probably the best informed commander of any army during the Napoleonic Wars, including Napoleon. Uh, he because he took the time to develop the networks and use the information. It's when, and as we mentioned earlier, it's when the problems was the information that was collected was occasionally ignored, and when it was ignored, things fell apart. And I gave the example of the retreat in 1812, and it wasn't a fault of the spymasters collecting information. It's how it was disseminated afterwards. I would say by the end of the war, the networks that were set up was equivalent to anything that would have been done during modern times. The only issue they really had was how they got the information back, because they were restricted to horses. There was no sending it back via the radios. But again, the information was really not time sensitive. So the fact that it got held up for a week or two was no one was going to die because of it.
So there you have it, folks. The men who enabled Wellington, at least in part, to be Wellington. Bob, this has been absolutely fantastic. If they haven't already, folks need to go and get, in the words of Wellington's Fighting Cocks, which is the after action reports for the Portuguese army. And we did an episode on that, so folks can listen back to that further in the catalogue of 200 or however many episodes it is now. So go find it, people. I'm not going to hold your hand. You've got fingers, scroll on your phone. It's a cracking episode. I have a feeling that might have been the one where it almost ended up being about 3 hours. So we might have split it, but I might have done you a disservice there. There was one where we got like 3 questions in and we were about an hour and a half deep into recording, and so we had to split it. But crucially, folks, Wellington's Spymasters, the reports of Colonel John Grant and Captain Lewis Ruman, is available from Ken Trotman Press. Please, 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 the usual plea, go direct to Ken Trotman and get your hands on this book. Very easy to find it via Google. It's listed as Napoleonic Archive 15, and it is also co-edited with friend of the show and regular contributor Gareth Glover. So please do head over to Ken Trotman to get hold of that. Bob, it's a joy as ever to have you on. Thank you so much for giving us such a detailed and interesting breakdown. We had no exploding quills, no sort of couriers sort of spontaneously exploding. Sadly, no Aston Martins. Like, we had horses, we had prancing horses. So maybe Ferraris, but like nothing truly Bond-esque. But you know what? It was much more interesting because it was real. So thank you so much for sharing this with us.
Well, it was my pleasure. Hopefully we can do it again on another topic sometime.
Folks, you have been listening to Wellington Spies from the Napoleonic Wars podcast. We will be back very soon. Hello again, folks. Please remember, we're still fighting back from the Spotify nightmare, so please do 2 really simple things to help us rise from the ashes. First, whack that subscribe button, especially if you're on Spotify, since you're likely to have been one of the ones who has disconnected, but do it on whatever platform you listen to your podcasts on. Second, like and leave a comment. It helps bump us back up the algorithm to reconnect with our lost audience. If you're a fan of the show, why not leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify? Go on, you know you want to. Did you know that you can now join a mailing list to get regular updates on all the news about newly released episodes, meetups for patrons, new lines of merch that have dropped, and all the hot gossip on what's coming soon? Because let's be honest, This show is all about the hot gossip. To sign up, go to www.thenapoleonicwars.net and fill out the relevant online form. Much love to all my Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of perks on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out how you can join a buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying things like courses, socials, a book club, green room access to recordings, early releases, exclusive episodes, and much more besides. Shoutouts to our patrons who, at the time of recording, in early September 2024, are in the mentioned in dispatches tier, Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jamie Kingston, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mark Trowbridge, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Mark Chestnut, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findlay, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, and Indiana Fats. The Admirals, John Haynes, Bob Burnham, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Dan Hazelwood, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Mohern, and the enigmatically named Zed, who I promise isn't just me trying to boost the numbers here. The Chiefs of Staff, Adam Coslin. The Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser. The Legion de Scholars, Dan Hazelwood. And in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, and Josh, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well. And as always, thank you for listening.